5 billion years later. 5 billion years later.
Several days later. 3 hours later. The next day. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Just then, 12 seconds later. Several months later. 82 kilometers later. 3,000 years later. One debt to society later. 3 days later. 6.5 hours later.
A few minutes later.
Flashback. 8 hours later. 2 weeks later. Much. 1 shift later. 2 hours later. 11 minutes later. 1 hour. Several song-filled hours later. 3 hours later. End of flashback. By sheer coincidence. 1 pair of pants later. 7 hours later. 1 operation later. Meanwhile. 75 years later. Meanwhile. 8 hours later. 3 days later. 1 pathetic sob story later. 1 minute 37 seconds later.
5,000 celebrities later.
A little later. Opening night. 2 hours later. 1 season later. The next month. Later that night. The next day. Much later. 8 semesters later. 24 hours later. 12 o'clock midnight. Later, in the void. Day 4. More moments later. Tomorrow for sure. 346 minutes later. 3 hours later. The next day. 2 days later. A little longer than a few minutes later. Approximately 10 hours later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
The very next evening. Yesterday. 8:01 p.m. 1 hour later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. Montage. Epilogue. 16 paranoia-filled days later.
Meanwhile,
80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3 days later. 2 hours later. The next month. The next day. 2,000 years later. Day 2. The next month. 5 minutes later. 2 hours later. 2 hours later. Tomorrow. Several bad puns later. 6 months later. Day 3. Later that same evening. 5 minutes later. The next month. 2 hours later. 1 hour later. Many unbearable hours later. 3 weeks later. Later. A lot of boring math later. 1 eternity later. Many tic-tacs later. Many hours later. Moments later. 298 frozen patties later. 1 hour later. 5 minutes later. 72 hours later. 1 winner later. 4 to 6 more days later. Moments later. Thousands of tears later. Much later. 1 long angry line later. Later that night. The next morning. 2 very boring minutes later. Early the next evening. Later.
1 hour later!
A few inches later.
4 to 6 days later. 1 hour later. 1 semester later. 3 days later. 3 hours later. 1 frozen wasteland later. 6 hours later. The following day. 4 to 6 weeks later.
6 months later!
Moments later. 2 hours later. The next morning. 24 hours later. Later. 1 little boost to the surface. 3 weeks later. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Many secret parties later. 6 hours later. 5 hours later. 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
The next day. Meanwhile,
1 hour later.
10 seconds later. Late again. 6 months later. 20 minutes later. The following Thursday. Later. Epilogue. Later. The next morning. Much later.
70 years later.
Just then. Eventually. 1 weekend of pampering later. Graduation day. Later. You get the idea. Soon after. 3:28 a.m. Meanwhile, a few minutes later. 2 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. 15 minutes later. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands. A few moments later. 7:59 a.m. Many months later. 1 million zillion jillion dillion cotillion times later. 48 hours later. 1 nap later. 1 week later. 1 week later. Many minutes later. 1 very long digestive tract later.